recognizing the land that we're on right now and thinking about that.
Great. Just take a few minutes, and then we'll go around and we'll do introductions. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So thought we'd start with an overview of, start with an overview of what reproductive health, rights, and justice are, so we can ground the space again, really in talking about what are these really, really important movements. And I also want to emphasize, so I work for NARAL, but I'm not an expert, and I know that there are lots of folks in the room who have experiences working in this movement. So I encourage you to speak up, shout it out, raise your hand. Whenever you want to speak, please do so. Because I am not the only one speaking up here. I want you all to be part of this too. So, reproductive health. So there are really three movements within this large frame. So reproductive health, so it's a service delivery model. Reproductive health groups really provide health services. They do health education, which, as you see, can include abortion care, it can include birth control, it can include sex ed, all of that good stuff. The reproductive rights framework, that's where I'm coming from. It's a legal and advocacy-based model, focusing on protecting the legal right to access reproductive health care services, centered on bodily autonomy, and it has a large focus on protecting abortion access. Reproductive justice. This is something that's really important and that we're going to spend some time talking about in this first section. As defined by Sister Song, reproductive justice is the human right to have children, not to have children, and to parent the children that we do have in a safe and healthy environment, as well as the human right to bodily autonomy from any form of reproductive oppression. So the RJ framework focuses on the intersecting oppressions that we face. It looks at power structures, and it centers the most marginalized. Everybody good? Any questions? So I hope you all can see this okay. This is kind of an overview of the organizations within our movement. Certainly not all of them. It's just kind of a selection. So you'll see over here on the left, we have reproductive health. So for example, talking about Planned Parenthood. So they're in the reproductive health and the reproductive rights sections. So Planned Parenthood has a C3 wing, which is going to be providing the health care, and a C4 wing, which is focusing on the political advocacy. I worked for Planned Parenthood when I first graduated, and I worked for their C4 side as an organizer. So we have a lot of groups up here: Planned Parenthood, the Abortion Care Network, Backline, just to name a few. We have NARAL up here, of course, for reproductive rights, Planned Parenthood, the National Abortion Federation. We have Advocates for Youth with Reproductive Justice, Sister Song, Sister Reach, Forward Together, Women with a Vision, Spark, really great groups. We will give you a list of these at the end so you will know who to look up, who is doing this really awesome work. But that's just kind of an overview of the three movements. Super quick, I know, but we only have an hour now left together, so I want to make sure that we get through all of this. A little bit more on RJ. It's an intersectional framework. It examines race, examines gender identity, examines income level, ability, sexual orientation, age, it examines your immigration status within the context of reproductive oppression. Another really important point about RJ, so when we're talking about RJ, we're talking about communities. RJ is community-based, and it links reproductive freedom to the conditions within one's own community, not just on an individual level, which is really, really important. It was created by women of color. It was born out of a need to discuss health needs for women of color, which mainstream white organizations were not doing, like NARAL, like Planned Parenthood. It's incredibly, incredibly important. It's important to know really where RJ came from, why it was developed. Really good. So thinking about the RJ lens, so the reproductive justice lens means that we apply this framework to a certain issue. and it becomes really broad, really, really intersectional. So I'll go through this, and we have some examples as well to illustrate this. Thinking about RJ requires us to go beyond the main issues that, again, large, mainstream, mainly white reproductive health and rights organizations, Planned Parenthood, NARAL, et cetera, because RJ is about much more than abortion access, which when we're talking about NARAL and Planned Parenthood, that's what they tend to focus on, is abortion access and also birth control. But RJ expands to pretty much everything. Applying the RJ lens to a given issue really helps us see that RJ is a universal concept. Since RJ is intersectional, since it's community-based, and it's rooted in the human right to be free and healthy from oppression, it encompasses almost everything. It's really powerful, it's really awesome, and I would encourage you to do some more research on it because it's really fantastic. The RJ lens connects communities and issues that may seem unrelated at first, but are actually intrinsically linked. I'll go through a couple of examples as well. So, the water crisis in Flint. When we're talking about Flint, when we're talking about environmental justice, that is reproductive justice. Contaminated toxic water is damaging to families. Between 9,000 to 10,000 children and a couple thousand of pregnant people have already been exposed to this contaminated water. Parents have used this toxic water to prepare formula and have breastfed their children after drinking the water. Also, for pregnant people, lead can increase the risk of preterm delivery, low birth weight, and miscarriage. And so I think it was a Democratic debate maybe 2 months ago, and a lot of folks were saying, well, they're not talking about reproductive health, they're not talking about rights, but they were talking about Flint. Flint is an RJ issue. It's reproductive health, it's reproductive rights. It focuses on a person's right to live within a healthy and safe environment. And if you can't, that's not RJ, that's not just. So we really want to push you all, and the world in general, I guess, to think about these topics that aren't being talked about within the mainstream and thinking about them specifically, I'm thinking about them as issues that relate to RJ. Sound good? Any questions so far? So again, like I said, the Flint water crisis, absolutely an RJ issue. It interferes with the human right, to parent children in a healthy environment and live free from conditions that may make it unable to even have children. Second example, talking about police brutality. Again, a central tenet of RJ is the right to parent your child in a healthy and safe environment. If you're in a community that is devastated by police brutality, that's not a healthy community, it's not a safe community. RJ links community conditions. Again, it's really, really important part of RJ. So it links community conditions to reproductive destiny and sexual and reproductive self-determination. So, it's a quote. Let's see. So if Black parents are constantly living under the threat of violence for themselves, their children, or their potential future children, this is not reproductive justice, not at all. If you aren't safe in your community because you're racially profiled by the police, that's not really a full articulation of reproductive justice. Police brutality is also detrimental to queer survival. Talking about trans women of color, they are direct targets of police violence. As Princess Harmony Rodriguez writes, Black and or Latina transgender people often find ourselves the target of increased police hostility because of white supremacist, transphobic policing being distinctly opposed to our continued existence. The Black Lives Matter movement and the RJ movement are linked. They just are. And it's really, really, it's really, really important to really recognize that and to understand that these movements are not separate, they are linked. And we want folks to be thinking about this as we get in our groups today for this workshop, to always be thinking deeper, and to be thinking deeper and to think really critically. It's important. So you may be wondering, how is this all relevant? Our workshop is based on reproductive rights. Yes, but we thought it was incredibly important to start with an overview of RJ, because RJ allows us to think about issues in a deep and an intersectional way. RJ should already center queer and trans voices. The reproductive rights, on the reproductive health and rights movements, however, while they may aim to include queer and trans folks, ultimately fail to do so. In my work with NARAL and with Planned Parenthood, I've been incredibly frustrated that so much of the framing, like about health issues, is just really straight and really cis. Talking about reproductive health only as a women's health issue is not enough. Talking about abortion as a women's issue, it's not a women's issue. Trans folks and non-binary folks can get pregnant. This is an issue for everyone. So in my work, I found that it was a huge struggle. I had someone, when I was previously employed, tell me that it's not important enough to focus on because queer and trans folks are just a small part within the community. And that's not okay. Like, I never want anybody to tell me that I'm only like a small percent of a community, that my voice and my experiences and my body have no weight and have no matter. So that's why I'm really, really passionate about this work. I think it's incredibly important. So the purpose for the workshop, we want to get to a place where reproductive rights organizations do include and also center queer and trans people. While we come from a reproductive rights background, we want to draw from RJ's practices of centering marginalized voices. We're going to do some group work in a little bit, and we want you to think about this RJ lens when you're in your groups. Try to apply the RJ lens to topics we offer you. I'm going to think about them in an intentional way, to go outside the mainstream. So if you hear things from Planned Parenthood, from NARAL, from these larger organizations, try to dig deeper. We really want to have like a really radical conversation here, and we want to push you all to do that and also support you in doing that. So in your groups, we want you to think about some questions. And I'll go through the groups in a minute. What does it mean to center queer and trans voices? Have you ever experienced a part of the reproductive rights movement where you felt that queer and trans voices were centered? What did that feel like? And primarily, what would blank look like if queer and trans voices were centered? Now I'll bring Jen back up here. We're just going to talk through an example. We think it might be helpful for y'all to see kind of what we envision as this activity moves forward. For example, how can we queer sex education so that queer and trans folks are prioritized? So in your groups, and again, I'll go through them in a minute, we want you to think about your certain issue. We want you to brainstorm, come up with a list of how does that certain issue, how is it not inclusive right now, and what are the steps you can take to make it more centering for queer and trans folks? And we can, we'll go through our example, and we can answer any questions you might have on that as well.
Cool. So in thinking about this, one of the examples that came up for us that we talk about a lot is how to queer sex ed and what that would look like if queer and trans folks were at the center of that and prioritized in that way. And some ideas that we came up with were sex for pleasure, a radical idea. And I think if we are centering queer and trans folks, that the idea that sex can only be for reproduction is lessened. And obviously reproducing happens and can happen, and if people want that to happen, yes. But I think sex for pleasure would be much more accepted if larger mainstream organizations were talking about it in a way that centered queer and trans folks. Another example of like a possible thing that could happen if we were talking about sex ed in that way is that this idea that motherhood and femininity are or femaleness are intrinsically related would be lessened. It would go away. Who can parent and who's allowed to parent, who has access to parenting, and what does that look like and how is that gendered? And if we're queering these ideas, the gender binary kind of becomes less of a huge deal and it's not at the center. What's at the center is human rights, which is the reproductive justice framework. So yeah, breaking into the groups, we'd love for y'all to work together and think collaboratively and really dig deep and think about what our different movements could look like if we were centering our voices and if we were making all of these really important decisions at the center of the movement.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So we have some groups. As you'll see around the room, there are sheets of paper. You can go towards whatever group you want. They're not pre-assigned or anything. I hate that, so just gravitate towards whatever you want. So I'm going to try to read these. We have justice over here. We have justice for immigrant families, family and birth over there, sexual violence on college campuses, Medicaid expansion, abortion access, and birth control and menstruation. What we're going to do, we're going to get in groups for maybe half an hour or so, and then we're all going to present to each other, and the ultimate goal is to leave with some ideas, with some tools that you can take back home with you for organizing, some tools you can take home with you for organizing for these issues. Are there any questions about groups or the activity? Any clarification?
Can you hear me? So we were talking about what it means to center queer and trans voices in the talk about Medicaid expansion. We were talking about how a lot of people just have this false idea of who accesses and benefits from Medicaid expansion. We just kind of see the image of this welfare queen. There's a false image that you really have to look to find. We were saying that the reality of Medicaid is that it's for families, it's for queer and trans folks, it's for LGBT folks, and people don't see the struggle and the good things that Medicaid offers to people. And the thing about this is it could benefit everyone if we just include the voices of queer and trans voices talking about single, low-income people. It would just bring individuals to the forefront. We were also talking about a good example of how queer and trans voices are centered is the Ryan White program when it comes to HIV care, if anyone's familiar with that. If you're low income and you have HIV, you can get medication automatically through Ryan White. And that's a primary preventative notion that says that we're going to give money on the front end to benefit long term and benefit the country as a whole, lowering transmission rates, lowering ER visits and intensive care later on because we're providing medicine at the forefront. And that's including trans and queer voices at the forefront of that issue. And just looking at that program and emulating that and giving health care to people who are low on income regardless of disability and household size and marriage status helps everybody. It helps our economy because we save money if we invest in preventative and primary care. People also, if we look at queer and trans voices at the forefront of the issues, usually we talk about mental health and holistic health a lot more when we talk about these issues, and that's bringing that to Medicaid expansion as well, and prevention and primary care. So you get a bit more holistic care with this kind of Medicaid expansion if you were to look at the LGBT community as an example. Do I need to add anything? I think that's all. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, thank you.
So we were talking about queering and including more trans voices in the discussion about sexual assault on college campuses. Some of the things that we came up with were changing the language that's used in talking about policies and specifically Title IX policies and then preventative education that happens on college campuses, usually in the orientation week. So including the queer and trans voices in those sessions. We talked about the ways that the Title IX policy has many mandated reporters on college campuses that aren't trained in LGBT 101 sessions and therefore aren't able to support the folks that are reporting, but also often don't tell folks that are reporting that they're mandated reporters, which then creates a cycle of re-victimization and a lack of support and resources for those folks. We talked about training for law enforcement officials on college campuses that would go as far as LGBT 101s and then more support and resources from those offices. We talked a lot about addiction and alcohol abuse on college campuses going hand in hand with sexual assaults. And the lack of resources, the lack of discussion that happens within the queer community itself about violence within relationships and alcohol use and the subsequent violence that ensues after alcohol use and substance abuse. We talked about the Greek life system, which I actually don't know a lot about because I work at a liberal arts college, but that's why I work at a liberal arts college. We talked a lot about needing to include more about disability when talking about sexual assault on college campuses, and talking about queer folks with disabilities and different abilities, including their voices in the consensual sex orientation sessions that happen. And I read that and I can't read it. The community accountability resources. So if folks aren't interested in going to law enforcement officials, that there are perhaps other resources available or able to be developed that include community accountability. That's a wrap.
Awesome. Hello, yeah. Do you hear me okay standing right here? Alright, so we were talking about family and birth. And what was really cool was just, for me, like looking at the people that made up our group, people who have families, people who want to give birth, and people who work within these like healthcare systems, and as far as like what training and education and stuff looks like. And so I won't like touch on that, but I think that that's really cool to know the components that kind of went into this discussion, right? So the first thing we have here is visibility. So when we were talking, it was a lot about like what does family look like, and what does family look like for like queer communities, and just different lifestyles and identities and everything like that. So what that looks like when you're navigating maybe like hospitalization or something like that. When it's someone mentioned like having to distinguish if like education or like counseling was provided or to a family member or a friend, and so what kind of that might look like. So yes, getting like what different families look like on the table, right? And then talking about cultural competencies. So how much of the time, like as like queer people, we often have to educate the people who are supposed to be like helping us with our own healthcare, and like what different trainings could look like in terms of centering queer and trans folks. Like speaking for myself, like I'm a nursing student, right? And so we hardly talk about like our people at all, which is heartbreaking, especially when you think about all the people that are going through this curriculum and this program that just are excited to learn but just aren't given that opportunity. So if we centered our voices, then maybe we could see a lot more of that happening. And I think also just recognizing that in like the healthcare system and a lot with like birth and pregnancy, how much we need to honor the history of people's stories and stuff, and so what trauma looks like, and like how in the hospital and just like any healthcare place, like our people have been traumatized like repeatedly, and so we often like may not go, or what it looks like to be your own advocate, and like how hard that can all be. So honoring our own history and the resilience that we've had to come up with, right? And medicalization of labor. So what it looks like when there's this hierarchy of, you have these healthcare professionals telling you what your body should be doing, instead of, really empowering patients to listen and feel what your body needs. And then we talked about like adoption challenges and even legality of it, right? And then talking about primary care for trans mass patients, and better ways to comfort our people, and I guess that kind of summarizes it in kind of a rambling way. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, thanks.
So when I came up to justice for immigrant families, I really didn't have any ideas, but we were discussing our various experiences, the ACLU, rape crisis, and also NARAL. And we talked about, first and foremost, we've noticed that there's not a lot of stuff outside of English in so many of these service organizations, so making them multilingual and not just the written materials but giving presentations. And then, when you're talking about queer people in these marginalized immigrant and then families, there's a lot of intersection that you need to take account of, and have somebody who is living all those intersections to be the person that's speaking to the immigrant families about the justice, reproductive justice. Visa application process to make that kind of reflecting the recent passage of laws, and so if you have a queer couple, then they can have legal rights and be on the path to citizenship, just like a straight couple would. Having safe spaces, apparently, what was which,
We're talking about creating change, how ICE was invited, like making sure you don't have officers in safe spaces for people of color.
yeah, so,